First thing I noticed was the smell. Antiseptic and something underneath it, something metallic and wrong. I tried to open my eyes and couldn't, not all the way. My lids felt like they were weighted down with sand. My mouth was dry. There was a sound, steady, rhythmic. A machine somewhere to my left, counting my heartbeats like it didn't trust me to do it myself. I didn't know where I was. Then I did. A hospital. I was in a hospital, and I didn't know why, and I couldn't remember. And the panic that started to rise in my chest was immediately flattened by something chemical and thick, moving through whatever IV they had in my arm. I turned my head an inch to the right. My mother was sitting in a chair beside the bed, her coat still on, her purse in her lap like she'd just arrived and hadn't decided yet if she was staying. She was watching me. And the moment our eyes met, something changed in her face. Not relief exactly. Something more careful than relief. She leaned forward and pressed one finger to her lips. Just that. One finger. Eyes steady on mine. I stared at her. She tilted her head very slightly toward the door, and then she shook her head once, slow. I closed my eyes. I didn't understand, but I knew my mother. I'd known her for 31 years, and I knew that face, that particular set of her jaw, and I understood that whatever was happening, she needed me to be quiet. She needed me to be still. She needed them, whoever was on the other side of that door, to think I was still unconscious. So I lay there. I let my breathing stay shallow. I let my hands stay loose at my sides. And I listened. I heard footsteps in the hallway, 2 sets, unhurried. The door opened. A wave of cold air came in with it. Still out, a man's voice. My father-in-law. The nurse said she's stable, my mother said. Her voice was perfectly calm. I had never loved her more than I did in that moment. They're not sure when she'll wake up. A pause. Then another voice, my husband's mother. Well, that gives us some time then. Time for what? My mother asked. Nobody answered her. I heard my father-in-law move to the other side of the room, near the window. I heard the soft tap of his wedding ring against the glass, a habit I had noticed at every family dinner for 3 years, and never thought anything of. I thought about it now. The insurance policy, he said quietly. It'll pay out either way. The question is, the house. The house is in both names, his wife said. It won't be for long. I felt my mother's hand close over mine on top of the blanket, very lightly. So lightly I wasn't sure I'd felt it at all. And then I was sure, because she squeezed once and then she let go, and I understood. She'd heard it too. She needed me to keep still. I kept still. My name is Sloan. I'm a forensic accountant, which sounds dry, I know, until you understand what it actually means. It means I follow money. I trace it through shell companies and offshore accounts and creative bookkeeping, and I find where it went and who moved it and why they didn't want anyone to know. I've done it for 11 years. I'm good at it. I've been asked more than once to testify in federal court. I say all of this not to brag, but because it matters to understanding what happened next. Because the people who put me in that hospital bed made a critical mistake. They forgot what I did for a living. Or maybe they just didn't take it seriously. Maybe they thought that because I loved their son, I had left the part of myself that noticed things at the office. They were wrong. I met my husband at a charity gala 3 years before all of this. His name was Scott, and he was warm and easy to talk to, and he laughed at things that were actually funny, which sounds like a low bar, but had not been my experience with men up to that point. His family had money. Old money, the kind that doesn't talk about itself. And I had grown up solidly middle class in Ohio, and I won't pretend that the difference didn't take some adjusting to. His parents were polite to me, in the way that people are polite when they've decided not to like you, but haven't found a reason yet. We got married after 18 months. It was a beautiful wedding. His mother cried. I thought they were happy tears. I noticed small things over the first year that I filed away and didn't think too much about. The way his father took Scott aside at holiday gatherings and spoke to him quietly in rooms I wasn't invited into. The way his mother asked casually about my work, but specifically about which clients, which firms, whether I ever did private family estate work. The way Scott started asking me, here and there, to put my name on things, the vacation property in Vermont that went into both our names, the joint account he suggested reopen for household expenses that had a funding pattern I wouldn't have thought to look at if I hadn't spent my career looking at exactly that. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself I was bringing my work home in a way that wasn't fair to my marriage. I told myself that not everything was a scheme. Then, 4 months ago, Scott asked me to sign a property restructuring agreement. He presented it on a Sunday evening while I was making dinner, set it on the counter next to the cutting board, and said it was just a formality for some estate planning his family was doing. I was tired. I had a glass of wine in my hand. I skimmed it, and I signed it, and I told myself I'd read the full version later. I didn't read the full version later. I know, believe me, I know. I'm a woman who has caught Fortune 500 executives hiding assets in Cayman Islands trusts, and I signed a document without reading it because my husband put it next to the cutting board while I was making pasta. I have thought about that moment every single day since. 3 weeks after I signed it, I was driving home from a client meeting on a Tuesday afternoon. The roads were clear. The weather was fine. I came through the intersection on Briar Hill Road, the one I've driven through 100 times, and the black SUV ran the light and hit the driver's side of my car so hard that the last thing I remember is the sound. I woke up in the hospital, and my mother was sitting beside me with her finger pressed to her lips. I found out later that she had arrived 40 minutes before Scott's parents. She'd driven 2 hours from Columbus the moment the hospital called her, and she'd been there long enough to overhear a phone call my father-in-law made in the hallway. She didn't catch all of it, but she caught enough to know that when Scott's parents arrived, I needed to appear to still be unconscious, so she sat there. And she waited. And when they walked in, she told them I hadn't woken up yet. My father-in-law stood by that window for 20 minutes, and in those 20 minutes he said things that I recorded on my mother's phone, which she had quietly, calmly slipped under the edge of my blanket while Scott's parents were looking at the monitors. He talked about the property agreement I had signed. He talked about how, with the restructuring in place, the Vermont house would revert to the family trust within 90 days regardless of what I did. He talked about the joint account, which I would discover had been steadily drained over the past 6 weeks into a business entity I had never heard of. He talked about Scott. He talked about him in a way that made my chest feel hollow, like a parent talking about a move on a chessboard, not a person. And then his wife said, "What if she remembers something about the intersection?" And my father-in-law said, "She won't. And if she does, it doesn't matter. There's nothing to connect it." My mother's hand found mine under the blanket again. This time she didn't let go. I was discharged 5 days later. I had 3 cracked ribs, a grade 2 concussion, and a laceration above my left ear that took 11 stitches. Scott was at the hospital every day. He brought me flowers on day 2, yellow tulips, my favorite, and sat beside my bed and held my hand and told me how scared he'd been. And I watched his face while he said it, and I looked for something real in it, and I found something. I'm not sure what. Maybe he genuinely hadn't known the extent of what his parents had planned. Maybe he had, and it still didn't feel real to him because it had happened to me and not to him. Maybe some part of him loved me, and another part had just decided that other things mattered more. I didn't ask. I wasn't ready. I had work to do first. My mother stayed with me for the first week after I came home. She didn't ask questions. She made soup and she watched television with me, and she didn't say a word about what she'd heard in that hospital room until I brought it up myself. When I finally did, sitting at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning, the recording playing between us on her phone, she looked at me for a long time and then she said, "Tell me what you need." That's my mother. That has always been my mother. I had spent 3 years feeling vaguely embarrassed by the gap between her Columbus schoolteacher life and my in-laws' country club world. And I want that on the record. I was wrong, and I am ashamed of it. And she is the reason any of what came next was possible. What I needed was time and access to my own professional network. I called a colleague I'd worked with on a federal case 18 months earlier, someone I trusted completely, someone who owed me a favor, and someone who happened to specialize in marital asset tracing. I told her what I'd signed. I told her what I'd heard. I sent her the recording and the documents I'd been able to get from my own files, which turned out to be more than Scott's parents had anticipated, because I am the kind of person who keeps copies of everything, including things my husband asked me to sign on Sunday nights while I was making pasta. She came back to me in 6 days. The property restructuring agreement I had signed was real and legally executed. That part was clean. But the entity my father-in-law had been funneling money into through our joint account was not clean at all. It was a limited liability company registered in Delaware with a registered agent address that traced back to a law firm that had also handled the paperwork for 3 other asset transfers out of estates that had been contested in probate court over the past decade. 2 of those cases had been settled quietly. 1 was still open. My colleague's words, "Sloan, these people have done this before." I sat with that for a long time. I want to be honest about what that felt like, because I think people sometimes expect the moment of confirmation to feel like power, like clarity. It didn't. It felt like standing in a room I had decorated and realizing the walls weren't walls, they were painted backdrops. And behind them was something I didn't recognize at all. I had chosen this family. I had sat at their Thanksgiving table. I had smiled at my father-in-law's jokes and complimented my mother-in-law's garden, and I had believed on some fundamental level that the life I was living was real. Some of it wasn't. That was the thing I had to keep moving through. Not around, through, before I could do anything useful. It took me about 4 days. I went back to work 3 weeks after the accident. I told Scott I was feeling better, which was true, and that I was glad to get back to normal, which was not. My ribs still ached when I moved wrong. My head still hurt in the afternoons. But I needed access to certain systems, and I needed the cover of a normal routine, and I needed time. The first thing I did was contact my bank separately from the joint account and freeze my own assets, the ones in my name only, my personal savings, and the IRA I'd had since my 20s. The small brokerage account I'd never told Scott about because it predated us and it never came up. The second thing I did was call a family law attorney, a woman my colleague recommended who specialized in high-asset divorce, and specifically in cases involving financial misconduct. I will tell you what she told me, because it matters. The property restructuring agreement I had signed was enforceable, but the manner in which the joint account had been drained, without my knowledge or consent, into an entity I was not informed of, constituted financial fraud under Illinois state law. The fact that there was a pattern of similar behavior connected to the same law firm gave us grounds to push further. She filed a motion for emergency asset preservation the same week. A judge granted it within 48 hours. Scott found out on a Friday evening. He came home from work, and I was sitting at the kitchen table, and he looked at me for a long moment before he said anything. Then he said, "You know." I said, "I've known since the hospital." He sat down across from me. He didn't say anything for a while. Outside, the neighbors were getting their mail. A dog was barking somewhere down the block. The refrigerator hummed, normal sounds from the life I thought I was living. He said, "My father said it was just estate planning." I looked at him. "Scott, I'm a forensic accountant." He put his face in his hands. I don't know what he knew and what he didn't. Genuinely, I don't. That is something I have made a kind of peace with not knowing, because I think the honest answer is complicated and probably lands somewhere in the middle of the spectrum I don't have words for. I think he understood that his parents managed money in ways that weren't entirely clean. I think he chose for a long time not to look too closely. I think that is a choice, and I think choices have consequences, even the passive ones. He moved out 2 weeks later. The legal process took 8 months. I won't walk through all of it, because some of it is still subject to a confidentiality agreement, and some of it is just tedious in the way that legal processes are tedious. But here is what matters. The joint account funds were recovered. The property restructuring agreement was challenged successfully on the grounds that the consideration I had received was misrepresented at the time of signing, meaning I had signed under a materially false understanding of what I was agreeing to. The Vermont house was sold. I received my equitable share. My father-in-law was not criminally charged. I want to be clear about that, because I know it's what people want to hear, and I won't pretend I didn't want it too. His attorney was very good, and the evidentiary bar for criminal financial fraud is high. But the civil findings were documented and they are public record. and the law firm that processed the paperwork is currently under investigation by the state bar in connection with those 3 probate cases my colleague had found. That investigation is ongoing. I testified as part of it, in a conference room downtown, with a court reporter and 2 investigators and my own attorney beside me. I sat across a table from people who asked me very specific questions about financial structures and documentation patterns. It turns out that 11 years of forensic accounting is useful preparation for explaining, in precise, incredible terms, exactly what someone did with your money and why it was wrong. My mother drove up from Columbus for the day I gave that testimony. She waited in the lobby of the building and she bought me a terrible cup of vending machine coffee, and she didn't say much, which was exactly right. There are things I have learned from this that I did not know before, or that I knew professionally but not personally. And I think the difference between knowing something and knowing it in your own body is significant. The first is this: love is not due diligence. I am not saying that cynically. I am saying that love is a real thing and due diligence is a different real thing, and doing one doesn't substitute for the other. I did not read that document because I trusted the person who handed it to me. That was a choice, and it had consequences. I am not saying I deserve what happened. I am saying that trust is not a legal defense, and I wish I had known that more viscerally before I learned it the way I learned it. The second is this: the people closest to you are the ones with the greatest capacity to reshape your reality. Scott's parents had been managing my perception of our life together in small ways for 3 years. What was normal, what was expected, what it meant to be a part of their family. That kind of management is quiet and cumulative and very hard to see from inside of it. I'm a person who looks for patterns for a living, and I missed it for 3 years. I don't say that as self-flagellation. I say it because I think it's important to understand that this does not happen only to people who aren't paying attention. The third thing is harder to articulate. When I was lying in that hospital bed, pretending to be unconscious, listening to a man talk about my house and my money and the accident that had put me there, I was terrified. My ribs hurt. My head hurt. I didn't know how much danger I was still in. And underneath the terror, there was something else, quieter and colder. The recognition that I had built a life inside something hollow, and now I had to figure out what was real. It took me a while to understand that the terrifying thing was also an opening. I know how that sounds. I'm not grateful for what happened to me. I'm not going to tell you that everything happens for a reason or that this was some kind of gift. It wasn't. It was a violation, and it was frightening, and the 8 months of legal process that followed were exhausting in a way that I am still recovering from. But I came out of it with something I didn't have before. Not wisdom, exactly. More like calibration. I know what my numbers look like now. I know where my money is. I know which relationships in my life are structural and which ones are decorative. I know who sat in a chair beside my hospital bed for 5 days straight and didn't leave, and I know who handed me flowers and held my hand and was, on some level, still choosing his parents. I know the difference. I didn't always. I got a voicemail 4 months ago from a number I didn't recognize. A woman's voice, hesitant and careful, saying she'd been given my name by someone she wouldn't identify. She said she was going through something with her husband's family. Financial, confusing, she didn't know where to start. She said she was scared. She said she didn't know who to call. I listened to it twice, then I called her back. She was 28. She lived in Michigan. Her situation was different from mine in the specifics and very similar in the shape of it. The slow accumulation of small decisions, the documents she hadn't understood. The family she'd married into that was friendly in ways that now felt like a strategy. I'm not an attorney. I told her that clearly. But I know what financial documents mean, and I know which questions to ask, and I know the right people to connect her with. I spent 2 hours on the phone with her that first evening, and I have spoken with her several times since. She has a good attorney now. She's going to be okay. I don't think I would have called her back before. I would have felt the pull of it, and then I would have decided it wasn't my place, or that I didn't have the bandwidth, or that getting involved in other people's private situations wasn't appropriate. I was very good before at finding reasonable reasons not to extend myself. I deleted the original voicemail after I returned the call. I don't need it anymore. I know what I heard. I know what I did with it. And I know more clearly than I have ever known anything, exactly where I stand.